Section 11.5, how to solve the quadratic equation, but these are special equations. Instead of having the second power, you're dealing with a fourth power. Process is very similar to quadratic equation. So solve this equation, select the correct choice below. So we start with problem number 1. When you want to solve the equations like that, there are two ways to do it. One is you make assumptions that x2 is equal to a, and when you raise 2 to the power of 2 is x4, so x4 is a2. So if you substitute x2 and x4 with a and a2, then you have the second degree equation. And when you solve the second degree equations, let's say if you're using quadratic, you have a value as 9 and 36. When you find the a, then you return to your assumption. A was equal to x2. A is 36 means x2 is 36. So when x2 is 36, x is plus or minus square root of 36, which is plus or minus 6. And the same thing for 9. So you notice here, because the power is 4, you end up having 4 answers. Positive, negative 6, and positive and negative 3. Or you could just go ahead and solve the equations. Just say, you know, how you always formula is x. Instead of x, you put x2. But when you solve at the end, x2 is 36 or x2 is 9. But since you want to find the x, that's how you find the x value, by taking the square root of both numbers. So there are 4 answers: negative, positive 3, negative, and positive 6. So we make this assumption for most of this problem. For instance, in this one, the power of this parenthesis is 1, and here is 2. So if you assume that x2 minus 1 is a, x2 minus 1 quantity square is a2. So when you replace all this here, then again, you have a quadratic equations. You solve it for a. A is 11, but assumption is that a is x2 minus 1. So a equal 11 or x2 minus 1 equal to 11. A is equal to 3 or x2 minus 1 is equal to 3. So here, if I move negative 1 to the other side, x2 is 4, and x is plus or minus radical 4 or plus or minus 2. 2 answers here and 2 answers here, so you have 4 answers for the x. So first you make the assumption. When you make an assumption, now you are looking at the quadratic, and you solve it, and then at the end, you go back to your assumption and resolve it. And then we have that for these problems. Again, what's the assumptions? n plus 28 is a, or n plus 28 is a2. Then you solve this equation of a. A is 27 and 3. A is 27 and A is 3. What was A? A is n2 plus 28. So then you have n2 plus 28 equal to 3, and n2 plus 28 equal to 27. Now here, n2 is negative 1, so n is plus or minus radical negative 1. So you understand that radical negative 1 is undefined. If you use your calculator and take a square root of negative 1, it's undefined. So you don't have a real answer, but you remember that anytime you have a radical minus 1, radical minus 1 is always equal to I. Okay, so we put that one here. So n is plus or minus I, or there are 2 complex numbers here. Same thing. When you take a square root of negative 25, radical negative 25 is undefined. When you use your calculator, square root of negative 25 is undefined. But if I want to remove this negative, I can remove this negative and put it here. So you have plus or minus radical 25i. And radical 25 is 5, so there are two answers. Two answers here and two answers there. So there are 4 answers, but they all are complex numbers. This is a case that you assume x to power of -1 is a. So when you raise it to the second power, x to power of -2 is a2. You put those numbers here. Again, you solve the a. A is 6. A is what? A is x to power of -1. So x to power of -1 is 2, and x to power of -1 is 6. Anytime you have a negative exponent, we had this formula in algebra. If you want to change it to the positive, you use this formula. It would be 1 over x to power a positive number. Like x to power of -1 is 1 over x. Then when you cross multiply, x is 1 over 6. Here also, when you cross multiply, x is minus half. So there are two answers for these problems. Again, the middle term is a, and when you raise it to power of 2, it gives you 1/2. So that would be a2. See, again, this is a formula in algebra that if you have more than one exponent, you always multiply. So like here, when I take 1/4 and raise it to power of 2 or 2 over 1, 2 over 4 is half, which is this one. So that one is a2, this is a, you solve it for a. Now, y to power of 1/4 is 2. To solve this, you could either raise both sides to power of 4, because then 4 times 4 is 1. But in this case, you don't want to do that. Why? Because if you switch this to that, then you understand that because the root is even, you cannot have negative number. So this one, you should not raise it to power of 4 because you are dealing with an even root and you cannot have the negative number. So there is only one answer, it's a 16. You cannot accept the other ones. The same thing here, it's very similar to that. Before I work on this problem, remember with the equation, you should always have all in one side and equal to 0. So you need to do that first. And then you make assumptions. Y to power of 1/4, when you raise it to power of 2, then it gives you that. So it will be a2a, you solve for the a, then you take each of these and say, but again, this is like previous problems. You cannot have 4th root. If the root is even, you cannot have negative on this side. So this problem has only one answer, which is 81.